Thank you, Scott, and good evening. Wynne and I are going to take turns telling you the story of what we uncovered in our research about James Monroe's enslaved community in Virginia and beyond. We started in 2008 as members of the Black History Committee at the Thomas Balch Library. Dr. Daniel Preston was the keynote speaker at the library's fundraising event at Oak Hill, which was President Monroe's home in Loudoun County. And as committee members, we wondered what was known about Monroe's slaves in Loudoun County. And so that's how this project started. We set our goals as identifying as many named slaves as possible, creating a database of those references, and finding descendants. We started with Dr. Preston's books, a comprehensive catalog of the correspondence and papers of James Monroe. In order to focus our research and to manage it, we actually created a database of all those references so we knew where to go to look for records and to create a research plan. And our research took us to the Library of Congress, the Albemarle County and Loudoun courthouses, UVA, College of William and Mary, the James Monroe Museum right here in Fredericksburg, and of course our research facilities at home. We located and reviewed primary documents such as letters to and from Monroe, deeds, wills, estate documents, and lawsuits. And we used existing research on the writings of Monroe and research that had been done at Ashlon Highland, which was Monroe's home in Albemarle County. Unfortunately, the story that we can tell you about Monroe's slaves can only be done through the eyes of others, whether it's James Monroe or his family members or his farm managers. We have no stories from a slave's perspective. And while our talk tonight is going to focus on the enslaved, it will be helpful to provide a little bit of a background about James Monroe. He was born in 1758 and served during the Revolutionary War. He was a minister to France, governor of Virginia, secretary of state, Secretary of War during the War of 1812, and the 5th President of the United States, serving 2 terms from 1817 to 1825. His first purchase of land in the county where Wynne and I are from, in Loudoun County, was with his uncle Judge Joseph Jones in 1796. Monroe married the beautiful and well-educated Elizabeth Courtright of New York, and they had a daughter, Eliza, a son, James Spence, who died in infancy, and a daughter, Mariah, who married Samuel Gouverneur in the first wedding to be held in the White House. And it would be Mariah and her husband who would later inherit Monroe's Loudoun property. Monroe's largest purchase of land was first in Albemarle County, including 3,500 acres that he came to call Highland. It was near his friend Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, and today it's known as Ashlon Highland. In the late 1700s, as I just mentioned, he and his uncle bought land in Loudoun, and that eventually came to be called Oak Hill. And Monroe also bought property in Henrico County near Richmond that he called Ashfield, and of course he owned property here in Fredericksburg. So here's a map that just shows you where Loudoun County is in the red arrow, and Henrico and Richmond. In Loudoun, we had to look under several names for our research, not just Monroe's. This slide shows the names of personal property tax records, men such as Judge Jones, who he co-owned the property with, and Andrew Monroe's brother. And just to give you an idea of his Loudoun property, this is one of our favorite deeds from Loudoun. It's known as the saddlebag map for this little notation down on the left-hand side. It was done in 1818. It was a survey of his property. And if you'll notice, there are sawmills and grist mills on the property, probably small mills that serve just the needs of Monroe's plantation, because we know that he took grain to both the Aldie Mill and the Oatlands Mill for grinding. And also note on the upper right, there's a structure that isn't labeled but is probably a house. There was a small frame dwelling on the property where Joseph Jones, Monroe's brother, and also Monroe himself stayed before the large house we know today was finished in 1822. One of the things we'll talk about tonight is his constant financial difficulty. To satisfy debts, he was often trying to sell his property, both land and slaves. In 1809, after he acquired full possession of his Loudoun lands after his uncle's death, Monroe attempted to sell the property. And this was an ad that ran in the local newspaper, the Washingtonian. And you'll see that he is advertising 25 slaves, a stock of horses, cattle, and hogs, 2,000 acres, and he describes his slaves as being very valuable, some of them being good house servants, and the others principally young men and women. Obviously, Monroe was not successful in selling the property because he kept the land and he eventually built a larger home there. And this is Oak Hill, the property that we know today. This was the home where Monroe and his wife Elizabeth retired to after his second term as president. And now Wynne is going to start our discussion about his enslaved community.
This was written by Monroe in 1823, a letter he sent to Fulworth Skipwith, a friend of his. In the course of this long service, my slaves have increased in number, having been kindly treated, so that they amount now to about 60 or 70, young and old, male and female. And the portion of this I want to highlight is the two words, kindly treated. He was a slave owner, and a lot of us think today, clearly you can't think of slavery and kind treatment as synonymous, that if anything, the two terms are opposite of each other. So we're going to talk about that tonight, but keep in mind this is how Monroe viewed himself. And again, he dies in 1831, so this is later in his life, and he's been a slave owner for a long time. This is a 1820 census from Loudoun County, where we've listed the slave owners by the greatest number of slaves that each one owns. And the fourth person down is underlined, that's William Benton. He was an overseer at Oak Hill because in 1820, Monroe was living in Washington, D.C., serving as President of the United States. So he wasn't at Loudoun, but he owned the property out there, and his overseer had 42 slaves on the property, making him the fourth largest slave owner in Loudoun County at that time. The next slide is from 1830. We did the same information, but by that time Monroe is retired and is living at Oak Hill. And now he has the greatest number of slaves of any slaveholder in Loudoun County. Now again, this is 1830. In the Deep South, people will have hundreds of slaves. And so when they're farming the cotton plantations in the Delta, there's a lot more slaves held by individual owners. But in Loudoun County, Monroe is clearly the highest one up there. Right behind him is George Carter, who lives at Oatlands, is a historic plantation where Lori works today. So there weren't a lot of large slaveholders in Loudoun County, but clearly Monroe at this time is by far the largest. Now this gives a breakdown of his slaves, of those 66 people, and you can see that in gender, 34 males, 32 are females. Typically on a slaveholding plantation, you want more working male slaves. So typically you would have a lot more males than this in relation to the females. And also, if you can see the distribution of age, he's got 14 slaves over age 55 out of a total population of 66. So these are people that he's held for a long time. Most of these are families that he's held for years, and their population has increased. But we have learned that he has purchased slaves and sold slaves during his lifetime. This is a chart showing the personal property taxes for the two main plantations that he had. Highland, that's in Albemarle County, and Oak Hill, that's in Loudoun. And Albemarle is the blue line, and Loudoun is the red line, and you can see how it goes up and down. It's not a static increase, nor is it staying level either. So he's actually changing his population of slaves as he has a need for slaves. Again, most of the years that Monroe is living, he's an absentee landlord or absentee owner. He's actually having overseers run his plantation while he's off serving in various government positions over the years. But you can see how Finally, the blue line ends because he ends up, Lori showed you the ad that they tried to sell Oak Hill, but he was unsuccessful doing that. So he ended up selling the plantation in Albemarle instead. But then by 1831, when he dies, after that, the other line, the red line, is other owners, inheritors of hers, which are primarily Samuel Gouverneur, his son-in-law, who is married to Maria that she mentioned. And now I'll turn back over to Lori.
So what was life like for a slave who was owned by James Monroe? Most of Monroe's slaves worked as farm hands or in a skilled trade on his plantations. One of the farm managers at Oak Hill kept a day book, and from it we learned about his farming practices. We know that he grew wheat, corn, and rye, and the slaves would have planted, harvested, and processed those crops. They cut timber, sawed logs, and made fence rails. They constructed a barn and probably other outbuildings. They tended to the livestock, and they slaughtered hogs. We know from private letters to family members and farm managers that at least some of the slaves were moved between Albemarle and Loudoun as needed for work. This would have been for planting and harvesting and perhaps building. And we believe that some were brought to Loudoun to construct Monroe's larger home there. Being a large landowner, Monroe needed skilled workers, and we found a few documents that identified certain slaves by name and occupation. Tina Hennings, or Thena Hemmings, was one of the first slaves we were able to document by name. Monroe purchased her and her 5 children in 1794 from Thomas Jefferson. She was the sister of Sally Hemmings, and you probably know that Sally was owned by Jefferson. There is speculation that Tina was married to Peter the gardener, but we haven't been able to find documentation to prove that 100%. We would like to learn more about Peter Mallory. He was one of the enslaved at Highland and is believed that he might have constructed some of the buildings there. He had been moved to Loudoun at least as early as 1823 because there's an inventory of Monroe's property that year as he was about to hire a new farm manager. Peter and his wife Charity are listed in that inventory. And it's possible that Peter was brought from Highland to work on the construction of Oak Hill. Not only is he someone we want to learn more about because of his carpentry skills, but also because the name of Mallory is a fairly common name in Loudoun County, and there could be a connection to some of those people living there, but we just haven't found that yet. But we know little or nothing about the other slaves who are listed on this slide. Monroe generally appeared to keep the children with their mothers, and when they reached a certain age, some were trained for a trade. In a letter to his uncle Joseph Jones, Monroe mentions a boy who is working with Peter the gardener, and he says that he wants the lad to be put to the blacksmith trade, 1 or 2 other boys to the carpenters, and 1 to the bricklayers. And we know that Monroe paid some of his slaves for services or goods made in their spare time, and Wynne's going to talk more about that later. One of the surprising things that we learned from our research was the high degree of mobility some of his slaves had. They traveled frequently without supervision, often at great distances. In a 1793 letter to James Madison, Monroe wrote that Peter will bring the articles to your house, meaning that Peter is going to be bringing the articles from Highland to Montpelier. In June 1817, when Monroe was president, he wrote to an assistant in Washington requesting him to return his horses to his property in Loudoun. He told the assistant he could do so by one of the servants, meaning he could do so by one of the enslaved. Monroe proceeded to give directions for sending other of the enslaved and horses directly to Albemarle. Other letters show slaves going back and forth between Loudoun and Washington. 2 letters in January 1821 discuss a slave named Hartford taking supplies by wagon to Monroe and Washington and then taking items back from Washington to Loudoun. Clearly, Hartford was trusted by Monroe to have this degree of mobility. In Loudoun, the toll collector for the Little River Turnpike kept an account book of the tolls and the activity on the pike. There are several entries for Monroe's slaves named Hartford, Sam, Beveridge, and George. And given the location, they could have been taking grain to the Aldi mill, or picking up flour, or transporting produce to or from nearby farms. But the point is that they were trusted by Monroe and his farm manager, and they had opportunities to be away from the plantation. And that's something that was much less likely for a domestic slave who was confined more closely to the house and to the family. Probably the biggest factor in a slave's life was also one of the biggest in Monroe's, his financial difficulties. For most of his life, Monroe was in debt, and he worried constantly about how to pay his creditors. In order to do so, he sold land, he sold slaves, or both, depending on his financial circumstances. And his financial troubles were due to three main reasons. First, he incurred significant debt in his public life, especially when he was an overseas diplomat and president. In later years, he petitioned Congress for reimbursement of his expenses, and they eventually agreed to reimburse a portion. In an 1828 letter written 3 years before he died, Monroe wrote, "My land and slaves have all been sold in Albemarle, as has been the tract of 20,000 acres in Clay County, Kentucky, in satisfaction of debts contracted in the public service, and large balances are still due." A second reason that Monroe was chronically in debt was that he supported most of his family members. His brothers in particular were a financial drain, living much of their lives supported by Monroe. And their financial dependency started early in life. When Monroe was only 30, he and a man named Larkin Stannard exchanged letters about the sale of slaves because Monroe's brother needed money. Here's a letter from April 4th, 1788, from Monroe. "I must entreat of you to dispose of those slaves for me if possible, as I want the money, or as much as can be got, for my brother immediately. Get as much money as you can down, and the balance in the fall. I should suppose they were worth at least 140 pounds. And then 3 days later he wrote again, "With respect to those slaves, whom I hope have already or will be soon disposed of, either for cash or tobacco, I know not how to command money from my brother otherwise, for it is impossible to collect it, and he is much distressed. You will do the best you can for me, get as much money, and give as little credit as possible." 28 years later, Monroe was still dealing with the financial dependency of his brother Andrew. Monroe bought a 325-acre farm in Albemarle for his brother and sister-in-law and settled them there for life. And a third reason for Monroe's financial troubles was because he was an absentee property owner. His public life commanded much of his time, and he was often away from his homes for long periods of time. He left the management of his plantations to family members and farm managers, and some of them took a lackadaisical approach to farm management. This is shown in 1816 when Monroe wrote, "My private affairs have suffered inconceivably great by my absence and the mismanagement of those acting for me. Yet I have always engaged men on the highest recommendations and supported them in their plans. By my absences, I sustained a most heavy loss." And this next one, which is one of my favorites, in regard to one of his ineffective farm managers, Monroe said, "I never saw for a person of some pretensions a less efficient man." For a slave, Monroe's money problems meant the uncertainty of being rented out or sold. It meant the fear of being parted from family members, friends, and familiar surroundings. The direction of their lives often depended directly on Monroe's financial situation. And here's another aspect of Monroe as a slave owner, and that's the duality of his feelings for their humanity, but also his view of them as valuable property. Monroe's correspondence often shows his feelings and concerns for his slaves and their well-being, but it also clearly shows that they are viewed as the property that they legally were at the time. Their values are of prime interest when he is discussing buying or selling slaves. This was especially true when his financial circumstances were dire. In 1796, Monroe and his uncle Joseph Jones corresponded about the purchase of slaves. Jones wrote, "Negroes are near 50% higher than a few years past, greatly, I think, above their worth, but the late high prices of wheat, corn, and tobacco have occasioned it." And in an 1818 letter, Monroe wrote to William Benton, his farm manager at Oak Hill, and we get a glimpse of how he values the work of female slaves. He wrote, "The plan you mention of hiring women to supply the places of men, as they may spin in the winter and in bad weather, is a good one. So in other words, the women have more value than the men because they can spin and do other work when they can't work in the fields. 2 letters from 1822 show Monroe's his view of a slave's value when attempting to buy or sell. On February 4th, he wrote to his farm manager in Loudoun, "Since my last to you, I have a letter offering to sell me Jack for $500, to which I replied that the price was altogether too high, and besides that, I was in want of money. I referred him to you, however, to see if you could agree on a price, with me paying him the money by degrees, part in hand." And 3 months later, he wrote, "I certainly will not sell the people at a sacrifice. $1,000 is the lowest sum that I will take for the family. They are worth $1,100 at least. High as that property is rising to the south." Monroe reached a point in 1823 when he considered selling his slaves to the Deep South. Construction of Oak Hill was done, and Monroe was in the last years of his presidency. In March of 1823, he wrote, "Judge Johnson and other friends have suggested to me the idea of placing my slaves on some tract of land in Louisiana, on some river employing into the Mississippi, and then to make cotton. It is said that land may be obtained there very cheap, for a few dollars the acre, to be paid by installments." And he continues, "I am assured that with a good workforce, 30 or 40 hands, and the young ones growing up, the hands would bring a handsome annual profit, and should I be disposed to sell of them after a few years, the slave property will be worth more than my hands in either of my plantations in Virginia." But he never followed through with this sale. Apparently, his friends convinced him that it was a bad idea and that he could lose money. Now, we don't know if his slaves ever had an inkling of this plan, but if they did, it would certainly have filled them with fear, because one of the worst things to happen was to be sold into the Deep South to pick cotton. So instead of the Louisiana idea, Monroe put his Albemarle land up for sale. When that didn't sell, and in need of money, in 1825, he deeded 2 Albemarle farms and 21 slaves to the Bank of Alexandria. And a year later, he deeded his Milton farm and 13 slaves to the Bank of Virginia. By 1827, Monroe had another plan for raising money. He wrote to Charles Fenton Mercer about selling his Albemarle slaves to Colonel Joseph White in Florida. But Colonel White hesitated both on account of the price and the number of children among them. But finally, by March of 1828, Colonel White decided to buy them. Monroe wrote to James Madison, "I have sold my slaves in Albemarle to Colonel White of Florida, who will take them in families to that territory. He gives me for them $5,000. And we can see from that exchange that the slaves were sold as families, which was important to Monroe, yet they were taken far from their home in Virginia. Any connections they had to Albemarle, to family members, to slaves on other plantations were lost. And in that same year, Monroe wrote to his son-in-law, "I have today received a letter from Mr. Watson, who informs me that he had sold Nelson and Charles only, the first at $700 and the other at $400. Now, we know Nelson and Charles were brothers, and Nelson was a blacksmith. What we don't know is if they were sold to the same person or 2 different people." And Monroe continued, "By selling my Negroes, I may obtain bonds, as the people who purchase them will be known to the directors. Being at liberty to sell them to whom I please, I may get a better price for them than if I sold them to one person." What he meant by that was if he sold them privately, he could transact with multiple buyers and he could have more leverage rather than a single buyer at a public sale or auction. In a letter in 1830 that he wrote, a year before he died, his duality this letter reflects his duality of recognizing a slave's humanity while discussing their value at a potential sale. He wrote, "Should I be pressed by creditors and forced to sell slaves, I should be glad to begin with Nancy, George's wife, and 3 of their children. She is a good cook and was suggested that some person at the university," and that would be the University of Virginia, "wished to purchase her. The oldest of the offspring who would go with her is a promising boy of 12 or 14. The other 2, a boy and a girl, are younger. I do not wish a bargain to be concluded, for if I can avoid selling by other arrangements, I will. In this letter, we see that he wants to keep Nancy and 3 of her children together. The oldest child was at an age where he could have been sold separately, and we know that other slave owners certainly did. But Monroe's desire to keep Nancy and 3 of her children together is offset by the fact that he's willing to separate all of them from George, her husband, and their father, and their siblings. After Monroe's wife, Elizabeth, died in 1830, he moved in with his daughter, Mariah's family in New York City. He was not in good health, and his daughters felt that it would be better for him to live with one of them. Writing from New York in March of 1831, 4 months before he died, Monroe said, "I am compelled to sell my property in Loudoun, which I have advertised. The advertisement comprises all but the slaves, whom I wish to sell at private sale in families." So to the end, Monroe recognizes the humanity of his slaves to the extent that he wishes to keep them together in family groups, but at the same time, he felt he could make more money by selling them at a private sale where he could negotiate with the buyer. So now let's talk about what we've learned about specific slaves. This is an 1823 inventory of Monroe's servants, stock, and plantation written by the Oak Hill farm manager as he's about to leave that position in Loudoun. It too was a helpful document because it shows the last name and it shows the last names and occupations. And this is a description of the inventory of Monroe's slaves done 5 years after his death. Unlike many inventories of slave owners, this shows the last names of slaves and their ages. And it was documents like these, plus letters to and from Monroe, that supplied many of the entries for our database. Our database of named slaves consists of over 330 acres, and 330 entries, and we have several more to add to that. And the database is available on the Thomas Balch Library website as a PDF. And our hope is that this will be of help to researchers and genealogists, and especially descendants, who are trying to locate primary resources of their ancestors. And this is an example of a page in the database. Now, this doesn't contain all of the fields in the database because they wouldn't fit on the screen. And it lists 4 entries for a man named John Baker. This is all the information we have, but we can determine there were at least 2 John Bakers. The blue lines show entries that could be for the same man, but we don't know. The John Baker with the red arrow is clearly different because he is too young to match the first 3 John Bakers. In 1836, he's only a child. And the red arrows show a family group. The first arrow is John Baker, the child of Mima Baker, who also has a child named Sally. And their entries came from the 1836 inventory that was done 5 years after Monroe's death. And the black arrow points to a man named Natus Berryman, which is a particular interest to us because there are African-American Berrymans in Loudoun County. And so far, we haven't been able to make a connection. And sadly, the Berryman's oral history, which has been captured at our History and Genealogy Library, their family stories only go back as far as the late 1800s. And that's not, uncommon for their grandparents and great-grandparents to not have talked about that time during slavery. And so I have just talked about the economic side of Monroe's ownership, and Wynne is now going to talk about the more humane side of Monroe's ownership.
I want to reinforce a point that Lori made earlier, was that the research we have done is heavily dependent upon the white people's recording of the history. That as far as any communications by the slaves directly, we don't have any. So again, keep that in mind as I read to you some information about specific slaves. These are letters written either by Monroe or to him, and I'll cite when they were and who was writing. But again, they're from the whites talking about some of their slaves specifically. The first letter is dated June of 1796 from James Monroe to Joseph Jones, his uncle. It's about Thena Hemmings. We lament much the ill health of Thena and anticipate the worst, but hope for her recovery. Her loss will be severely felt by Mrs. Monroe, who would not admit that it were possible to replace her by half a dozen in her place. Indeed, she is valuable as a sensible and honest servant, as well as most capable, and whose loss would never be repaired. We are particularly gratified that she is well taken care of and wants for nothing." And then a month later, in August of 1796, he again writes to his uncle, "We gravely lament the death of Athena. To her mistress and our child, she is an irreparable loss. We hope her children were well taken care of." And see, there's an indication in the letter that she's survived by some children, but it doesn't say that Monroe has those children or who exactly is taking care of them. So it raises a real question. Next is Roger. This was written in 1810, October of 1810, from Monroe to Fulworth, Skipwith, who I showed you earlier later. "Roger, whom I purchased at Mr. Braxton's sale last spring at the price of $140, that he may be forwarded to you. Having bought him for my own accommodation, I part with him solely for yours, with this remark, however, that his wife having been sold to someone to the south at the same time, he has been desirous of going that way in the hope that they might finally meet again. On proposing to sell him to you and explaining your character, residence, and etc., he was perfectly willing to go to you." So here's a situation where he's selling a slave that he's purchased in order so that slave can be closer to his spouse. Now, she apparently was sold to somebody else at the sale, and so she's in another part of Virginia, and by selling Roger to Skipwith, Roger hopes to get closer to his wife. The next letter is about Ralph and Vanessa, husband and wife. "Knowing that you contemplate the establishment of a farm, that it would be agreeable to you to take Ralph and his wife, you may do so at a valuation to be made by some of our friends. They belong to your father's estate, are known to you, and would, I presume, as Ralph has connections here, be unwilling to remove to Albemarle. Though whether I sell the estate or not, if you desire, you may have them." This is James Monroe to Charles Fenton Mercer in July of 1816. So Mercer, who was a friend of the Monroe family, Charles Fenton Mercer, and well known to him, they were both in the Fredericksburg area, but Mercer has established himself in the Loudoun area in Aldie, and so he's giving Ralph and his wife a chance to go to Mercer, who apparently whose family had been slaves of the Mercers in Fredericksburg. And then later on in February of 1817, he writes again to, this time to William Nolan, another Aldie resident. "The dispute between Mr. Jennings, overseer, and Ralph, the dread of punishment, had brought him to me. I wish my people to work, but not to be cruelly treated. This step of Ralph is an unfavorable circumstance. The difficulty attending it is the danger, in case not of supporting the authority of the overseer, that the Negroes will be encouraged in their disobedience and be rendered useless, which, as I cannot attend them to put things in order, may do me injury." But again, he's concerned about how the overseers are treating his slaves, but he knows he can't be there to deal with it. But then on the other hand, he's concerned that he might undercut the overseer's authority by helping the slave in this situation. And finally, there's George. And this next letter was written from Monroe to William Benton, one of his overseers, in February of 1822. "Do you think that George's leg is broken? That is either of the bones. Had you better ask Dr. Little whether he would want a consultation with a surgeon." Now, Dr. Little is a doctor near Oak Hill in Prince William County, and he'd been serving Monroe's slaves. There's a document at the James Monroe Library here in our James Monroe Museum here in Fredericksburg, where they list some of the patients that he had for a bill from Dr. Little. And anyway, then again in August of 1822, follow up on the same thing, he writes again to William Benton, says, "I am very uneasy about George's leg, which I hear is still sore. I fear that if he is not soon cured, he will lose it, or it will be like Adams was. Had he not better come here or lay up where he is till it is cured? If he comes down, it must be in a wagon, for if he walks, it may ruin him. This is a concern of much interest, as well on account of humanity as the values of the servant." So in that very last line of that letter, he actually makes the point that there's a difference between humanity relative to his slaves and also the value of those slaves. So again, as Lori pointed out earlier, he's torn between the two issues. He's dealing with these slaves sometimes as individuals and people that he knows well, but then he's willing to sell them off to some other place at the best price he can get. This was written in an article in the Virginia Magazine of History and Biography in 1993, and we found a very excellent article, and this was the author's conclusion. So the number of Monroe's slaves varied from year to year. The surviving records indicate that throughout his life, Monroe bought and rented slaves and indentured servants when he needed labor and sold slaves when he needed cash. Without overstating the obvious, Monroe simply considered his slaves valued property and dealt with them from this perspective. So that was the conclusion of that author. I generally agree with that position, and I think you'll have to listen to what we said tonight and weigh that with how Monroe viewed himself. I guess finally we're going to talk about things. We gave this presentation over at, or here at Mary Washington, what, about a year ago? 2 years ago, all right. And since then, we've done some more research, because when we started out, one of our goals was to identify descendants of the slaves of Monroe's, make a connection to actually people. And since we tried to do this, we've looked at things like census records. We went to Frederick County, Maryland, and made a trip because Samuel Gouverneur, his son-in-law, after his wife died, he had property in Frederick, Maryland, and that's where he was living, and we thought maybe he would have taken some of the slaves over to Maryland with him, but we weren't able to find any connections there. And then letters between Elizabeth Monroe Hay and her daughter Hortensia Rogers, she lived at Druid Hill in Baltimore, makes some reference to some of the slaves. This is a deed of trust that's recorded in Loudoun County, and it was also recorded in city of Richmond, because it relates to a property, ash field, that belonged to Monroe, and he gave the property in trust to his daughter and son-in-law, George Hay and Eliza Hay. And in that, he also gave them several slaves. And the slaves are listed in the document. And of those slaves, we know these were not part of the ones that were sold to Florida. They were actually transferred to the Hays, but then they're in Richmond in 1830 when this deed of trust is at Asheville. So we tried to track down some of those, and also in this case we have some interesting names. You can see that we have Joe Lumpkin and George Dabney and Jerry Dabney and John and Lewis Baker. All of these people are listed in that 1823 inventory from Oak Hill when the overseers were exchanged and they were making a transfer. So we know these people were at Oak Hill in 1823 and were then in Asheville in 1830. The first I have is a letter here from Hortensia Hay Rogers to her mother, and she's writing about Frank and Fanny. And again, they were two of the people listed in there. And she's talking about possibly having to take them to Maryland with her, but she's saying it was impossible to bring them here without an act of the legislature. So apparently at that time there's some legal restrictions on importation of slaves to other states, so she's not sure that she can take the ones from Virginia to there. So we've raised a question on that. And then yesterday morning a sleigh drove up containing Antonia Ringgold, and she talked about selling Asheville and said that they had an offer that would sell Asheville, all the Negroes from Asheville, for $1,400. So again, we don't know who actually they sold those slaves to, but we know for sure that they were probably sold about 1831 and changing ownership. Now here's one of our most interesting finds is Florida. In 1828, Monroe had sold all of his Albemarle slaves to a fellow by the name of Colonel White. He was Joseph M. White. He was the delegate from the territory of Florida to Congress, and he moved to Missouri in 1839, and then moved to Missouri in the 1830s, and he died in 1839. So we kind of thought maybe we had a dead end there and weren't able to track it. But then it turns out that his wife still lived on the plantation in Florida that he had, and the plantation is in the Tallahassee area and is known as Casa Bianca. And as a result of that, we did some research on the internet and discovered that in 1855 and 56, that the widow of Colonel White had made a arrangement with her nephew to take over her plantation for her, and in that she lists the slaves by name. There's 121 names on the list, and in this slide we've compared the names from that deed of trust in Albemarle in 1825 to the list in 1856 of the slaves down in Florida. And what's really interesting was one of the husband and wife, Betsy and Toby, there's a husband and wife, Betsy and Toby, in Florida in 1856. So we feel fairly comfortable that that's probably the same slaves that were sold there 31 years earlier. Well, the next step is through the census in 1870 and hoping to track them to then. But the question is whether they live that long. And also trying to identify their children, and maybe they'd show up in the 1870 census. But the problem is, in both of these lists, there's no listing of last names. So all we have is a given name, and it's much harder to analyze. And we also have Eve, which we think may be the same, and Ned. The Nelson and, let's see, which Nelson and who? Well, Nelson was one of the ones that was sold. Yeah, two of the people in the 1825 list were sold in a private sale that Monroe had. So we know they didn't go to Florida, but the others could well be names from Virginia. And then one of the other people that was interesting in all this was the Hemmings. Thena Hemmings, and I believe it's the sister of Sally, is that? Yeah, she's the sister of Sally Hemmings of the Jefferson fame. And there's a researcher in the Charlottesville area that's trying to track down descendants of hers. And so this is some of the information that he's gleaned and shared with us on his research that he did. But he's still trying to track down one of her descendants, or any of her descendants. Oh, did I push the wrong button there for sure then? Yeah, there we go. And then finally, Lori finally got an email from someone who looked at our database on the website, and she has an ancestor that was believed to be a slave in Albemarle County to Monroe. And so here's the genealogy of her family, and we're going to show you the next slide that is the basis for her understanding. Oh, if I don't keep pressing the wrong button. This was a newspaper obituary from 1878, and the latter part of it lists that Jones died of paralysis of the brain on the 9th day of January 1878. Mary J. Jones, aged 84 years, born in Charlottesville, Virginia, came to Washington in the year 1816 with President Monroe, in whose family she was born and raised. Funeral will take place. So this obituary in 1878 clearly documents that she came as a slave from Charlottesville. So we haven't been able to tie this into anybody on our data research. We had concentrated our research on Loudoun instead of total, but we're going to follow up on this and see if we can find any success. Again, we have a last name here with the Jones, but we don't always have names, last names in it. And if you go online and look at our database that Lori showed you, we've got it sorted alphabetically, but we have a column for given name as well as surname. So If you just know the given name of the person, you can search by that. If you know the last name, you can search by that as well. And I thank you for your attention tonight, and if you have any questions, we'll be glad to address any of those.